So as Jim said, my name is Joey Jones. I'm a creative director at Ayzenberg, mostly on the animation, visual effects, and CG side of things. But in a former life, I made part of my living telling stories. I was an aspiring filmmaker and would go to different studios and pitch stories. And in fact, I sold a development deal to Disney, feature animation. And for about a year and a half, I got a good taste of Hollywood and learned a heck of a lot. Additionally, I've also taught part-time on the college level, mostly storytelling classes. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a crash course in storytelling. So buckle up. I've split my talk up into 3 chapters, dare I say a 3-act structure. The first one's going to be about myth and the hero's journey. The next one is going to be about the evolution of story. Throughout today, there's been a lot of introspection and evolution of stuff, so I felt that's actually sort of the zeitgeist. It's kind of a convenient that. And then my third chapter, my third act, will talk about where we are today, the new methods of technology, and new ways of telling stories. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a personal hero of mine, Joseph Campbell. Campbell was a mythologist. So much like an anthropologist, he went around and looked at ancient cultures, other civilizations, societies. We're talking about Native American, South American, African, ancient Egypt, and studied their stories and their legends and their myths. And what he found was that they had a pattern. They had a theme. They had a series of beats that all of their stories shared. Now, why would I be talking about myth, right? Because today when we say something's a myth, it's a falsehood, it's false. But in pre-literate society, which, by the way, is the vast majority of our civilization, they looked at myths not as a true or a false. They didn't care. They looked at them for explanation, meaning, and ritual. So explanation, meaning, and ritual. And so having these separate societies with little to no interaction among each other have a shared story was pretty remarkable. And he coined this the monomyth. So it's a pretty cool quote. Myths are public dreams, and dreams are private myths, right? This is a part of, it's almost hardwired in us. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our cultural DNA. He then went on to study these myths and figured out that they had about 20 to 26 different beats. And he called that the hero's journey. So I'm going to go quickly and kind of talk about what the hero's journey is. And so, you know, for any screenwriter or studio exec, this now has become the 3-act structure. So the first one is going counterclockwise, is departure. So we introduce a character who is in an uncomfortable or a mundane environment. And he or she, typically it's a he, unfortunately for mythic cultures, gets a call to a venture that he refuses. He doesn't think he's ready. And if you notice in some of the movies that the e-gaming showed, you notice that I think his name was Simple. You can tell that he didn't want to leave Ukraine, right? He said, "I'm not ready." I mean, these are resounding themes that really grab at us. So the character refuses the call of action, but through a series of mentors and allies, he's convinced that he's ready. He's usually given a talisman, which is a fancy word for saying a sword or a magic apparatus to get him to cross a threshold. This is a very popular motif. It's the flux capacitor or the Delorian for Back to the Future. It's the wardrobe in the Chronicles of Narnia. It's the computer monitor for Tron. It's the rabbit hole for Alice in Wonderland. It's the house for Wizard of Oz. I could go on and on. But you cross a threshold. In mythic cultures, it was mostly going to Hades. It was going into the underworld. Which then leads us to Act 2, which is initiation, where there's trials, travels, and temptations, which then leads to wisdom, power, and treasure, which then allows our character to come back a changed person. It's very important, a changed person. And it comes back to where he started, and it's usually a resurrection scene right here, where he destroys, saves, and or redeems. In the 70s, when Star Wars: A New Hope came and exploded on the cultural mainstream, it became a part of our cultural fabric, even to today. Everyone's asking George Lucas, how the heck did you come up with this idea? And he tipped his hat and he said, you should look at Joseph Campbell and look at A Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is a seminal book that Campbell had written. And so every studio exec, every screenwriter, every Star Wars nerd became fascinated with Joseph Campbell. And so what I've done quickly here is show how Star Wars, in many ways, almost in every way, follows the hero's journey. So remember, this is a very condensed version. There's like about 26, depending on who you talk to, beats that Campbell described. One of the beats is that in the first act, you're given a companion who is both animal and human-like, aka Chewie or Chewbacca. Another part is a visit of the goddess or the princess, aka Princess Leia. There's usually a beat called the belly of the whale. So you'll notice the trash compactor scene. There's an atonement with the father. So it really doesn't get any better than that. The filmmakers of Matrix also have been pretty transparent that they're heavily influenced by Campbell. In fact, if you watch The Matrix, he literally gets a call to a venture, and he literally is hanging out the window and says, I can't do it. And obviously, the crossing the threshold is a telephone. I could spend hours upon talking about these. And then we go to Harry Potter, essentially the same thing. Harry Potter, its threshold is walking through the 9 3/4 wall. It also has a belly of the whale. I mean, I could keep going on. And for me, for many people of my generation, Star Wars was my myth, right? It was my myth to look for meaning, explanation, and ritual. For my son, it's Harry Potter. And so the other day I said, hey, did you know that Star Wars and Harry Potter are the same film? He said, no way. So I bet you, we shook hands through some research for a class. I then showed him this, and his mind was blown. I then collected my $10 and told him to learn his lesson. So let's talk about evolution of story. My next chapter borrows heavily from this book, Winning the Story Wars by Jonah Sachs. And he does this, one of his main theses is that story has evolved over these three eras. We're all very familiar with this kind of iconic imagery of a shaman, of a tribal leader, leading his flock in this engrossing story, which resonates, strikes a chord. And what's important to note is that these stories, which have been passed on for millennia, the best stories survived. The bad ones, they were forgotten. And they were transmitted through a web. So I told someone, he told 5 people, they told 10 people. You guys get it, it's viral. But no one owned these ideas. Everyone owned these ideas. And so as you told the idea, it got better because you would elaborate or you would share it a certain way because you thought it would be better. And so the stories mutated, they evolved. And anyone that has retold a joke can relate, right? When you're told a joke and then you retell it, you kind of just put your own little spin on it. You think you know how to make it funnier. You know how you can make it better. Same thing with the oral tradition. Sachs then describes how we went to the broadcast tradition. And he says that this started at the Gutenberg Press, the first book that was published. That now we have gatekeepers who decide which stories survive. No longer it's a survival of the fittest, it's survival of the richest. And he talks about how now instead of a web of transmission, it's a transmission to one, whoever's standing in front of that computer screen or the TV or what have you. And that, by the way, ideas are incredibly proprietary. If you're going to retell this story, you better pay me. And so stories were delivered with a bow tie, but a bow tie in legal tape. He's coined this new era called the digital era. And in many ways, we have returned back to the oral tradition in the sense that now it's survival of the fittest. Anyone that has a web connection or a web presence can now share their stories, and the best ones rise to the top. Anyone, for the most part, can borrow, steal, and remix content that they found online and get away with it. AKA anyone that's pulled down the latest Star Wars trailer and psychoanalyzed it for figuring out which one's the best. And ideas get passed or die. The thing that comes to mind the most is when the trailer for the last Star Wars came out, and everyone was talking about what the heck is up with Kylo Ren's lightsaber. And so my Facebook feed was just overflowing with reinterpretations because everyone's seeking meaning, explanation, and ritual in it, right? And Star Wars promoted this. They were happy with it. In fact, I would argue they knew exactly what they were doing. On the other spectrum is someone like Chrysler, who came with this great campaign imported from Detroit. It was so good that people started making T-shirts. And what did Chrysler do? They sued them. So instead of celebrating, instead of fostering it, they sued them. At that time, they were basically in the broadcast era. Okay, quickly. My last act, I'm returning it back. I'm departing. I'm actually returning back to where I started. We've talked a lot about AR and VR today. So I at the risk of telling you stuff you already know now, the big two players are Oculus and HTC Vive. You also got Google Cardboard, the kind of cheaper end. Both have pros and cons. I'm not going to weigh in on which one's better. Some great examples of content that's being produced right now. Stories is Henry on the left. Your left, which is an animated thing, ex-Pixar guy. Pretty cool. You're not directing out anymore. This isn't linear storytelling. You are actually completely creating an immersive experience. You're stepping into whoever invented that world. You're completely divorced from your natural environment. This is VR, virtual reality. On the top is Glenn Keane. He's an animator who worked on The Little Mermaid, and he's literally drawing Ariel in space. Pretty cool if you want to watch that. And then down there is Pearl. The interesting thing about Pearl, which is for the HTC Vive by Google, is that depending on the interactions that you make, you can lengthen or shorten the piece. So it's pretty cool. There's different triggers within the story. AR is augmented reality. So this is when you strap on a headset and you're still in your physical world, but your sound, imagery, and graphics augment your world. They make it better. I'm a bit biased, to be candid. I've been fortunate enough to work on a lot of Microsoft HoloLens campaign work. But there's other players in the market. For instance, Recon Jet is really segmented towards bicyclists who want to have a heads-up display as they're cycling. Once again, I've been fortunate enough to work on these are four of the many the pieces that we've done. But I really sincerely think that this stuff is really going to change the way we learn, the way we play, the way we work. And these are great examples I won't get into right now. And then lastly, we have the 360 cameras. You can think of these as an input device for your AR pieces. Facebook announced the other week they have their own, which is open sourced, which is pretty cool. You have the 360 Fly, which is about $400 at Best Buy. You have the Nokia Ozo over to the top, which is $60,000. And I think it does your laundry for that amount of money. But it also ties right into the Oculus. Some content that's being produced right now, pretty cool stuff for the Clash of Clans. They kind of situate you right into a battle zone, and you can look around and see what's going on. YouTube has its own channel. It was already alluded to earlier, this Star Wars piece where you're on a speed racer through Jakku. And then another personal hero of mine, U2, they've done this music video where we're on stage with them, and they've also brought in user-generated content from fans. So, in summary, if this stuff, this new advent of technology, in fact, I'm a little old now because I didn't even talk about YouNow or live streams, which are now influencing stories. If this stuff is going to be here to stay and not a novelty, it's got to talk about these archetypes, this stuff that's hardwired in us, this myth building. which is so important to telling stories. It's also got to recognize that we're in this digital era. Like Facebook, I think, gets it, right? They've put a ton of money into Oculus. They've spent a few bucks for it. They've also put out this 360 camera, which is open sourced. That's pretty ballsy. And we also realize that storytelling is communal. The fact that my wife gets mad at me when I watch Breaking Bad episodes without her is a testament that storytelling, even though they're sitting right next to each other watching the same flat screen and not saying anything, there is a sort of special bond that we have when we're listening to stories. A good buddy of mine, Eric Garland, has watched Star Wars Force Awakens over 30 times in the theater. And he's going not for the picture, he's going for the ritual. He's going to sit next to someone who hasn't seen it yet and laugh at the same joke or point at the same thing. And then lastly, transmedia. That's been fighting for its place for many years now. I think AR and VR, this is a story that's taken place over a bunch of different platforms, transmedia. I think that can really find its nest, its home, and really begin to tell stories across many different platforms. Thank you.
Thanks.